So welcome to
Thanks for coming.
Silverlight Radio Services and MVVM 101.
Thank you.
If that's not what you're here to see, please exit.
Make your bed.
Alright, so we're going to start with a new project.
Whoa, slow down.
Slow down.
So this is MVVM right now, you're in.
So what is this thing here we're looking at?
Are you running Linux?
I need some context. Tough crowd.
So actually, before you even get here, you need to install Silverlight 4 tools for Visual Studio 2010, as well as RIA services. Those do not come with the default Visual Studio install. And after you do install those, you're going to get with RIA services this Silverlight business application, which is basically this Silverlight navigation application extended to do with some extra folders in it for business use. And I'm going to be creating this off of an open database called the Chinook database. It's kind of like the Northwind database, just a little simpler. Northwind has kind of gotten unruly, so this is just a little easier to grasp. So I'm going to call this my RIA, Learn RIA Chinook project.
That means a warm wind, right? In the winter. It's a Chinook wind.
Nice restraint, Ben.
It was. I'm here to learn, Todd. Stop interrupting me.
I was expecting a dialog window to pop up. Okay, maybe that one pops up in navigation. I think it's already. So if you do a navigation application, you'll get a dialog box that will ask you to enable RIA services. So I'm guessing that must automatically be enabled.
That would have been if you had started a Silverlight project, right? A new Silverlight project?
Yeah. So I'm guessing that is automatically enabled when you're doing this
It is.
business application. Okay, so what we'll start with is adding our entity framework to the models. Call this generate from the database. Call it Chinook entities. And we'll just incorporate all the tables. And basically, this is the fake database is for a list of CDs in a store. Essentially, there's employees and albums and artists, and there's things like a playlist and some employees. And after you do this, you have to build to get the services to recognize that this entity model has been added. So now we're going to add some services, our RIA
This is
services.
a lot of T4 template work going on behind the scenes.
So we'll add a domain service class. Okay, so this is our service, I don't know, pop-up menu, I guess. And it's going to allow us to choose which guys on our entity framework what we want to include in our service. So we'll just include everything, and we'll enable editing on all of them. If you wanted it to be read-only, you could not check some of these boxes. And this box right here is going to generate a metadata class file for us. which will allow us to kind of control how the results get returned and allow us to add some data annotations. It generated this Chinook service and the Chinook metadata for us, and we'll jump into these a little later. But the Chinook service is here, and basically what it's done is generated get, insert, and updates and deletes for all of the framework models that we had. And so this is a one-time generation type of thing. Like you don't want to mess with any of the code that Entity Framework generates, but this code will never be regenerated. So you actually will have to go in here to create your own custom methods.
Do you, if you need to add something later, like another model?
You probably have to just copy and paste this code that's already there and modify it. I think there is a way that you could maybe inherit from this to create your own custom stuff.
Are you talking? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Are you talking in in conjunction with the existing one here?
Yeah, let's say
We're gonna have some serious problems trying to get, and I can't explain why, but you will come across some serious problems trying to share objects that were instantiated or pulled down from this with the other one. So if there's ever a need that you have to start extending and adding another model, I would almost do it inside of this again.
You just manually modify the code.
Right. Remember how we were talking about that?
Yeah.
At one point I said that you have to make this giant monolithic thing. That's what this is.
Okay. But
It's
you can modify and add extend it if you want.
I don't know why they do that. Maybe there's a way around it, but extend this, don't make another one.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to jump into Silverlight application and I'm going to create a new view. So this is going to be a page that will display all the artists in the database. So what I've done is dropped a list box onto the page. It's got a data template that is only going to display, it's going to have a text block which is going to show the artist's name. And so now we can come to the code behind and pull stuff from the service. Okay, so this code I've inserted, a good practice to do when you're designing items in Silverlight or WPF is in the constructor when you're going to do work, run a check to make sure that you're not in a design tool, because the UI for like Blend or in Visual Studio is going to actually execute this code in here when it tries to display it for the view, just in the designer itself. And so you don't want to run that code, otherwise sometimes it'll break the designer and you won't be able to use the designer. So what I've added is an event handler. Basically, when this form loads, we're going to call this loaded method. And what this is going to do is going to attach to our service, our RIA service, and it's going to pull, and it's going to tell the artist container that I put on the view to bind the items to the artist from the RIA service. And then I'm going to tell it to load the artists from using the get artist query method. And that was defined back here, so it's just this, if there's get albums, artists is right below. So any of your methods in your RIA service It's just going to attach the word query to the back of them when you get on the client side
And then-
within Silverlight.
Right, and when the things that are called service on the server side are not gonna be called context on the client.
Right.
So service gets fronted to context and query gets appended to the end.
Did you have like a reference to that, or how did,
It's magical.
it's magic?
It's auto magic.
Oh, yeah, okay.
How does that, where is that context at?
Actually, go up to.
Is there a reference?
Yeah, go up to learning, just touch this project right here, and then expand, view all items in the project. I don't know which one it is. There's one that you guys show all the files, generated code,
Okay.
right there.
So do you have to update that, like a?
It
web
automatically
reference?
updates it.
It automatically.
It's T4 templates. When you save, it automatically writes that, and you will sometimes get some really funky errors if you didn't do something right. It'll be an error indicating there's a problem with compilation. It doesn't give you the source file. That's what it was. I don't mean to keep interrupting.
No,
It's okay.
I expect you to keep interrupting.
Good.
We all do.
So anyway,
Yeah,
So
this line
it
is, this line right here, even, this is actually an asynchronous call. Even though everything looks synchronous right there, the loading is going to be asynchronous. And since we've assigned this item source is just to this property, it'll just update itself automatically when the results come back. And then we're going to modify the main page to set the default to my data is created.
Is there a completion routine that you can hook up to? You
There
get
are.
to do something?
Yeah, we'll get into that in a bit.
always want to jump ahead in the book, don't you, Gans?
All right, so there's our artists that we've pulled from the database, and so far we've written 6 lines of custom code, essentially the code behind it. All right, so now we'll create a details page, and obviously thus far there's been no view models at all in this project. So this is so far just kind of demoed binding and RIA services. So we'll get a little bit into the view model pattern here. Let's see. So we'll create a new page. And we're going to modify the navigation structure here. So the navigation framework in Silverlight supports kind of some custom navigation properties similar to how MVC does it. And so I can add a mapping so that artist list / name will actually map to views artist detail and put an item in the query string. So I can keep my URLs pretty, but still kind of get stuff from the query string.
Where does that code have to live, on the main page or just any page, or?
The main page provides our navigation frame, so this is where it hangs out here.
Okay, gotcha. And that's part of the navigation framework.
That's part of the navigation framework that was introduced in Silverlight 3.
Is that kind of like the master page?
Yeah, this is essentially this main page is kind of considered a master page, and then content will load within this frame right here.
Alright,
And your browser actually changes those URLs and
Yeah.
stuff?
alright.
Yep.
Nice.
So that's how we do copy-paste URL support in video collaboration. URL changes.
That's how the rest of the team did it.
Yeah, they did it. I didn't. I just stood there and looked dumb and drooled.
Okay.
Well,
So
I mean,
now
I
we'll go
have to be
to
realistic here. I mean, I didn't do anything. I slept most of the time.
Okay, so now we're gonna tell the list to navigate when the selection changes. I'm just gonna drop in a couple of methods here. So the selection change event is gonna be raised whenever I click on a different item in that list. So we'll call this method, and we're gonna request that the navigation service navigates to our artist list page, or the well, it's going to put the artist list in the URI, but that's going to get translated to go to the details page from the code I just inserted. And since everything is object oriented, I'm binding. I can get the selected item from my artist container, and that's an actual artist object, so I can pull the name off of that object to stick it in the URI. So we can show how that works quick. So I've navigated to the artist list /accepted, and I have back and forward support in the browser. So it's pretty cool. So I could bookmark this and come back directly.
That's one space.
Go straight to medicine.
It's going to insert %20 in there, but it'll still work.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Right.
They have lead zeppelin in there, that's pretty
Dream
close to
Lead
everything.
Singer had an album called Stream Lead.
Really? Steve Perry.
Steve Perry.
All right, so now we're going to do some work to load the artist by name from the URL. So we're going to jump back into the RIA. The RIA service. And we'll add a new method, get artist by name. So what we're going to do is we're just going to query the object context, our entity framework model, and then we'll say where the name is the name that's being passed in, and just select the first item in our list, because everything in link returns a list essentially. This line, the result.albums.load, is going to tell it to load the album subclass. When I imported the entity model, it automatically made the associations with the foreign key constraints and added them as subclasses. So I'm going to automatically load the albums as well as the tracks on each album.
Because it won't do that by default. Like if you pull back,
Right.
it won't pull back any children objects.
Right. It'll have a collection of albums, but it'll be empty.
Yep. That bit of
So-
CAS a lot.
Well, you can change that.
You can change that with like a setting, can't you, on the service?
Attributes.
Yeah.
But we'll get that later probably.
Okay. I just remember that was
Yeah, it's
a
another.
couple hours of what the hell.
But you also wouldn't want to bring down 155,000 records accidentally either.
Right.
So.
Yeah, if you do just
On
want to display
purpose.
the artist, then
Right.
you
No,
would
we call it fuzzy search.
Yeah.
So here's where I'm going to add a couple include attributes. I believe this is actually going to tell it. I have to do both, right?
To call load.
To return the result set.
I think this should be good enough, but we can try.
No one really knows.
Nobody really. It's a big black box. No, I've
It's
done.
about
I've,
50-50.
I've done the attribute before. And it's just has magically loaded for me.
Yeah, so sometimes though I've seen where it won't automatically load and we had to physically call load. So I'm going to do it in both places. And so this include is going to tell it to,
Is that load in that method you just made, is that synchronous then too? Or is that asynchronous?
that's synchronous.
Okay.
Because it's on the server.
Yeah, everything that happens on the server is going to be synchronous.
Okay.
The only asynchronous part will be once we get back to the Silverlight part.
gotta keep up here, Nick. Come on. Wake up, wake up.
What are we doing here?
Where am I? Who am I?
We just talked out there.
You lucky dog.
You lucky dog.
Can't be that old.
I lost 500 years of my life.
You're wise.
Yeah, but I forgot it all.
That's just you.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to actually get in here and add a view model.
Where's Luca?
Dog watching. What a wiener.
Schnauzer, actually.
That's a good one.
Great timing, Paul.
Okay, all of your view models need to implement iNotify property changed. That's how your class is going to notify your view that something has changed, and the view should automatically update itself. So it's kind of a pain, but in practice, what usually you do is create a base class for your view models that implements iNotify property changed. Then each of your view models will just inherit from your base class, and so you don't have to have this code in every single class. And now we're going to drop our model into our view model.
That iNotify property change is basically where the data binding begins. And so
Okay, so what I've done here is added a public property called model, which is the selected artist. And it has to be a property, and it has to be public if you want to bind to it from your view. And then, so whenever it changes, it's just going to raise this event, which the view is going to automatically subscribe to and update anything that needs to be updated. And in my constructor here, I'm going to require an artist name be passed in. And this is where I'm going to call my RIA service to load the artist. And so I'm going to pass in a delegate, which is the method that's going to be called once the load has completed. So this is all asynchronous right here. And then when the results get returned, I'm going to assign the artist that's returned to my model.
that's your completion mechanism.
And so the thing that gets returned, no matter what, is a list of, it's going to be called entities, it's a list of IEnumerable. And so even though I'm only returning one single artist, I still have to iterate this collection, because it's always returned as a collection, no matter what you're returning.
Isn't there a first or default method or something like that you could use instead, or not?
If
Do
you
you
wanted
have to loop through all of them?
If you wanted to pull the first one down only.
You just break after the first one,
I guess
or
not.
something.
The other thing too is that result is going to have information on there as to whether or not the call completed successfully. So you can do an if-else on has error, basically. There should be a has error, and then you can get the error back if there is a failure. So, and this is standard operating procedure with any kind of plug-in programming. It's all asynchronous. So you're just going to have to live with that.
So is all that, everything off context for the most part is asynchronous?
Yeah.
Okay. And another good thing to do is you want to make sure that you always have, we actually implemented context as a singleton pattern, because if you wind up having multiple contexts, you will wind up making multiple asynchronous calls to the server, and you would wind up with things getting really blown out of whack. So what we did is we had a singleton pattern. We always use the same context throughout.
Okay, so now I'm going to work in the code behind of my view to bind the view model. So onNavigated_to is an event on every page in a Silverlight navigation framework that's going to call once your page basically is navigated to, obviously. Since I'm accessing the query stream, this work has to be done in onNavigated_to. It can't be done in the constructor. Or in a load method either. Right. And so what I'm going to do is have my private view model be always available in this class, and when we get navigated to, I'm going to assign the data context of the page to the view model. And data context is a property on user controls for any WPF object, and it's always going to inherit from its parent unless it's overridden.
And you will not have access to that data context. If this isn't like an inheritance pattern where it's retrieving from a parent mode, you will not have access to that data context until on load is fired. So if you don't do anything in the constructor with the data context, not that you necessarily would, but it'll be null by that time. So it's just the chain of events that you have to deal with. So once you set this, anybody who would use that particular control as their parent would then inherit the data context from the parent once that control is successfully loaded.
So what I've done here is drop the text block on the page. It's going to show the name of the artist that we just selected, as well as a list of the albums that that artist has. And so you notice here, I'm binding to the model property and the name property on that model. And so that happens because I've just set the data context to my view model, and my view model has the model property. So it's kind of just walking its way down the tree.
Is this like NBC where model is a special word? I mean, could you have called that property?
I could have called that anything.
Okay, it's not.
Yeah, I named it model just so it was model view model
Okay,
type.
right.
I could have
But
named
it's
it
not-
artist.
It's not the magic like
Right.
NBC where
Right.
it confuses me constantly.
Well, there are some things here with like RIA that there are some naming schemes.
Okay, there
So
are.
like if you name your thing context, you might run into some problems and things like that, because obviously you saw service turned into query, service turned into context. And
Right.
you're pending the query in.
Okay.
You can come up with some naming conflicts there, but with this is
Alright.
pure data binding, so no, there's no restrictions.
So you can see here that I bound to the model name property as well as to the albums property on the model of the artist. So now we're going to show off some two-way data binding. So thus far we've just been reading from our data source, and we can actually write to it directly from the view as well. So if we jump back into our detail page. Yep, you get it for free.
Losing money not double binding.
So what I've done here is change my text block to a text box, and I've added another attribute to our binding saying this is a two-way binding instead of just a one-way binding. And I'm also going to bind the list of tracks that are on an album to the item that is selected in my albums list. So I've got this list box down here below, and my data context on it is going to be, I'm saying to bind to the album container object on this view and bind to the selected path property. And then the items that I want to bind to are the tracks property of the selected value. So it's a little confusing right here, but basically what I'm binding to is the selected item in this list box.
Album container dot selected value, added selected values tracks.
Right. And on this, I can also implement two-way binding to the unit. The unit price is the price they have for each track in their database, and so this two-way binding is going to work all the way back up the chain, and then it'll flow into the database naturally. So I'm going to add a save method in our view model now. After I copy it. Let's see, and we need to handle the save event on our button here. So we'll say view model dot save. And this is just save that I just added. So we're just going to tell the context to save to the database any changes that we have. So now if I go into this guy, and say this track is only 9 cents, click save, jump into the database here. See that accepted to has been updated. And
Uh-oh, Andy.
oh, there he is. So that saved happened without me having to call any code to update any of the models manually. It just all happened by the nature of the binding.
You called the actual add methods on RIA for you.
Yeah,
When you- Well, when you call, so, are we going to explain this? Am I interrupting again? Okay.
You're interrupting, don't worry.
As you were making modifications to the model on the client, shut up, Rich. As you're making modifications to the model on the client, the client is maintaining a list of change notifications for all that. And when you call submit changes, it'll invoke the appropriate methods on the RIA server side to update, to do all the CRUD operations necessary to complete those changes.
Do you have to do anything to discard changes when you leave this page? Because if you had listed in a singleton or something and you went to another page.
Yeah, I think on navigated from you want to do context.discard changes.
Yeah, there's a discard changes. So that's where the real magic of RIA comes in, is it allows you to keep the entity framework on the server and the entity framework on the client in sync based on the submit changes calls. Your changes are cached on the client until you want to submit them to the server through the submit changes. Yeah, that's what it is.
But in this case, though, I would not have to do that because my context is specific to the, it's local. So the context will just be disposed of.
But if you were dealing in a highly asynchronous environment where you may be having multiple contexts in operation, yeah, you'd want to be very careful with that sort of thing.
So at this point, basically all we have is a model and some binding, but kind of where the real purpose of MVVM comes in is when you want to add some business logic to your view model, and you don't want to keep your business logic code within your view. So that's why you want to use the view model pattern, so you can keep your business logic separate and test it separately. So
the general rule is as long as you're actually binding to data that has been already retrieved, you can do that inside the view. If it's manipulating the data or anything like that, you can do it inside the view model.
So what I'm adding here is a property, save allowed, which maybe we'd set on load of this view model based on the current user's authentication level. And I'll switch back to the view. And so my save button, and just say is enabled equals and so now I'm controlling how my view works without having any knowledge of the view itself. So basically, it produces a really nice, clean separation of responsibilities. Okay, so now one of the next items that you run into when you're developing an MVVM application is communication between your view models. So right now we have a pretty simple user interface, but you can, once your interface starts getting complicated and you have multiple controls on a page, and say, well, I'll just show you here. So let's, I'm going to show you how we can update the user interface from, after we click the save button, I'm going to put a message in the menu bar, which are kind of two totally separate items in our view. So for this, I'm going to add a reference to the MVVM Lite. Where's my browse at?
While he's digging around for that, we did, one of the things we did, they're kind of the out.
What? There we go.
One of the things we did that's kind of an outgrowth of the video collaboration project is we have code now which will automatically inspect your RIA model and invoke those methods dynamically for you, taking into consideration the hierarchy. So like one needs to be created before another and stuff like that. And so as you're adding these methods, it'll automatically include it in the unit tests. So you don't need to continuously write, oh, and now I need to write, you know, I added a remove method, now I need to unit test that. It'll automatically detect what parameters need to get passed, what objects need to get instantiated before, and it'll call the RIA methods necessary to get those, and it'll build the model and then pass it to that method. So we just keep adding the methods willy-nilly to that, and our unit test would stay at near 100% with the RIA side.
Okay, so I've changed my submit changes call now to have a callback after the save is completed. And when that happens, I'm going to use this messenger service, which is a part of the MVVM Lite framework. And so that's essentially what the messenger is. It's just a dictionary internally implemented, so that keeps track of who wants to receive what notifications. So this line here is just going to tell my messenger to send a message to anybody that's listening that a save has been completed. And so now I'll jump back into the main page and create a listener for that message. So just in my constructor, I've told my messenger to register for notification messages, and the parameters is, the first parameter is who should be responsible for receiving the message, and we're going to say it's our own class here, and we're going to execute this delegate when we want to be notified.
What was in the code that was sending that message again? What were the parameters you were throwing there? One was like save completed.
So the message sending is a generic framework. I'm using a notification message right here, but I could put any type of object there I wanted. And so the receiver on my main page, oops, he's going to register for any messages of type notification message.
Yep.
And this was in the MVVM Lite framework as well. But like I said, this could be any type of object that we wanted. So now if I change, oh, I gotta jump back and rename, we'll see it here.
Is there a reason you have to specify who you are as a listener?
I could, so say I had some sort of child object on this page, I could say that the child's object should be the one that receives the notification instead of myself. I've never actually implemented it any other way than receiving messages on the class.
You can understand the sender, just to make sure you know where the message is coming from. I guess.
Yeah, I've never used another object to do the listening other than the current class I'm in.
Honestly, I think that they just always expect you to pass this, and they're using this within that method to determine the object. I think it's just, maybe they were lazy, they didn't implement reflection properly or something like that. They could retrieve that value some other way, but they just ask you to always do that. But it won't work, and it never seems to work right if you don't pass this. So, pass this.
So after our asynchronous save operation completed, it sent the message and updated the user interface. And these calls, the save is asynchronous, but the messaging system is synchronous. There's nothing ever leaves. There's no like web service calls or anything, so that all is going to happen inline.
You can also give those, I don't know if you have that.
Oh yeah, I was gonna go over the parameter list as well. So right now this is kind of a broadcast message here. This is gonna say just send this message out to anybody that wants to hear, that wants to listen to it. And you can add overloads. So they call it a token, so that you can have basically to pare it down to certain listeners, essentially. And the way that we implemented that in video collaboration is we had an enum of message types. And so we would create a message type of save completed in this case. And then we just say, in here we say save completed. And then when you register for an event, you can do the same thing. Say, I want to listen to all notification messages, but only if it has the save completed token.
That way you don't have to write, a save completed message, update message, 4,000 messages out there for that, or message objects out there, all the same code internally.
Furthermore, if you know that there is a specific listener, a specific class that you want to send this to,
This is
it allows for that as well. So this overload, I could put, actually, so it'd be, and then so this will only get delivered to any object whose type is main page that's listening.
So that answers my question.
So I guess if you notice now I can jump back in more detail, and we still have, pretty much no code in our code behind, but we're still kind of, controlling our user interface without having any knowledge of the user interface. That being said, there's nothing wrong with having code in your code behind that does work, that is specific to that view. So here's my Sudoku Windows Phone 7 app, and I'm listening to the property change event on my view model, and if the property current box state gets changed, I do some work on the user interface. So there's no rule that says you can't have code in your code behind when you're using an MVVM framework. Just try to be knowledgeable about what is business code and should be in a view model, and what is view type code and should not be in a view model, or can be somewhere else. So that's essentially what I got.
The one thing that's interesting too, from a unit testing perspective, can you go back where you're instantiating the context object? This is on the client, right? Yeah. If you just act like you're gonna pass a parameter to the constructor, so delete 3 times and just open up the ellipse again. Go. One of those overloads, right there, a domain client. That right there is your entry point for unit testing, or not, excuse me, for mocking this entire layer. You can pass in an object here that implements an interface that will get called for every network request. And we also implemented a unit testing framework for that, where you pass in a special object, and it will reflect over all the types in your project looking for a particular attribute that says the name of the class that's just calling. And if that class has that attribute, it has to also have the corresponding method for the exact RIA method on the server that you want to call. You implement that in your return, it'll dynamically invoke that method, get the results back, and pass it back. So it looks like it's working just fine. And then those classes inherit from a RIA mocking class, and then from that you can get things like the unit test method that was called, the stack of the unit test method, and stuff like that. So you can easily pass it in and easily start unit testing and mocking out your entire layer. That's important if you're ever going to do anything like, we're also working on a thing for unit testing on the server-wide stuff. You're not necessarily going to always have a active connection to connect to on the server. You could be on a completely different server in a completely different domain, so you do need to mock out your networking, and that's how you do it right there. So, and that's an important thing moving forward if we ever continue to use Silverlight or WPF, is that most of these things have the ability to mock the network communication so they can be unit tested on a team build server and stuff.
And most MVVM frameworks include a view model base class for you.
Yeah.
So this is from the Galasoft MVVM Lite toolkit. So now it's gonna, it changed, notify property changed to something else. Raise property changed. Oops. And then the nice thing about this base class is that if, say I call this and I type in the wrong name here, it'll throw an exception when you're in debug mode. Because if I would have mistyped this and my view was specifically trying to bind to this, it wouldn't update and you wouldn't know why. I would expect this type of system to change in the next version of Silverlight, I think.
To be more strongly typed.
And as well as having some sort of more
Sure.
built-in MVVM framework.
It's obvious that as you start to use Silverlight a lot, it's obvious that the framework has changed dramatically fast, and it's a lot in a very short amount of time. And so you start running into things where you're like, well, it'd be nice if they did it this way. And then you pose that to the Microsoft people. The common response is, yes, we know. We ran out of time. So.
And it also gets a bit tedious to have to implement every property in full detail. You can't use automatic properties because you have to call raise property change every time.
Yeah.
So
That's what
just
I'm wondering in the future. If they
kind
start
of a lot of
implementing-
extraneous code.
They start implementing partial classes and stuff to hide away a lot of that crap.
So that's it.
Good timing. It's 1 o'clock.